the week. Remember, the Fed, the 10-year yield currently sits 4.04%.
Dr. Abdi. न्यूज आ गई। हाँ जी, पॉवल साहब ने भी
begin to shift our policy focus toward a more balanced one.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chair, in the past, during rate cuts, you used the word recalibration. And I wonder if you pointedly did not use it this time. And in fact, when you said policy is not on a preset course, did you mean that as sort of the opposite of recalibration? Are we meeting to meeting, data point by data point? Are we in the process here of getting back to neutral? Thank you.
So I think we're in a meeting by meeting situation. We're going to be looking at the data. Let me say a word about the SEP really here. So we often point this out. What the SEP is it's an accumulation of the individual projections of 19 people, showing what they believe at a particular moment in time to be the most likely path for the economy and thus the appropriate path for monetary policy as well. And as you know, we don't debate or try to agree on what that is. We just write them down and accumulate them. We do sometimes discuss them. And so we always say we're not on a preset path, and we really mean that. The actual decisions we make are going to be based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks at the time the decisions are actually made. So you will have seen that we have 10 participants out of 19 who wrote down 2 or more cuts for the remainder of the year, and 9 who wrote down fewer than, in fact, in a good number of cases, no more cuts. So rather than looking at this as certainty, I would encourage people, as always, to look at the SEP as through the lens of probability. And so there are different possible outcomes and likelihoods rather than this one is certain and this one isn't happening. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for getting to my follow-up question. Is the dispersion in the outlook a sign of uncertainty of policy in the meetings to come? Thank you.
It is such an unusual situation. Ordinarily, when the labor market is weak, inflation is low. And when the labor market is really strong, that's when you've got to be careful about inflation. So we have a situation where we have two-sided risk. And that means there's no risk-free path. And so it's quite a difficult situation for policymakers. And it's not at all surprising to me that you have a range of views. It's not so much about having different views for the path of the economy, but it's partly that. But it's also partly about what's the right thing to do in light of the tension between the two goals. How do you weight them? How worried are you about one versus the other? And so it's natural. I think it would actually be surprising if you didn't have a pretty wide range of views based on, in this kind of highly unusual situation, and we do. So, we get together, we discuss, we have a great discussion, and then we decide what to do and we act. But you're right that it's a wide dispersion of views, and I think that's understandable and natural in the current situation.
That was Jerome Powell.
With Move, you can check out the most convinced that we're getting 3/4 points for this year. So that's what we want to compare it against. We'll be back at probably like minutes before 2:00.
Yeah, minutes before. I'll see you going over to the midday show. Thanks, Neil. Great show. Thank you, everybody, for hitting the likes, man. Almost 2,000 likes today. So thanks so much for all of that. And yeah, we're going to go over to the midday. Watch stuff. I mean, I still got to go to Starbucks, man. I got my birthday drink. Free drink. You know what I just got to in the email was free 6-inch sub from Subway. That's actually pretty nice.
You get a free sub at Subway?
That's what I was saying. I was like, huh?
That's neat.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
They didn't always.
I like the Utah. Stock downside here a little bit to start things off this morning. Welcome to Fed Day. There is still a very, very tiny chance that we might get more than a 25 basis point cut coming up this afternoon from Fed Chair Powell. And more importantly, it'll be about what he has to say going into the remainder of this year and into next year, his final few months here as Fed Chair. That's a look at the overall NASDAQ right now coming off. It was a bit of a sell-off all day long yesterday. We ended the day back towards where we started or ended 2 days.
5 cuts. I mean, what were the kind of range of views you had about, on one side, why there was so much support for a cut today, and on the flip side, why there's so much divergence about what comes next?
So I think there's quite a wide assessment that the situation has changed with respect to the labor market. Whereas we could still say, and did say in July, at the time of the July meeting, that the labor market was in solid condition, and we could point to 150,000 jobs per month and many other things. I think that the new data that we've had, and it's not just payrolls, it's other things as well, suggests that there really is meaningful downside risk. I said there was downside risk then, but I think that downside risk is now a reality, and there's clearly more downside risk. So I think that's broadly accepted. And so that meant different things for different people. Some wrote down, almost everyone wrote down, supported this cut, and some supported more cuts and some didn't, as you will see from the dot plot. So that's just the way it is. I mean, people have, you have people who take this work very seriously, think about it all the time, do their work, discuss it with our colleagues. You know, we endlessly discuss this in between ourselves, and then we have a meeting where we put it all out on the table, and this is what you get. And you're right, there's a range of views in the dots, and I think that's, like I said, very unsurprising given the quite unusual, historically unusual nature of the challenges that we face. But let's remember though, the unemployment rate's 4.3%. The economy's growing at 1.5%. So it's not a bad economy or anything like that. We've seen much more challenging economic times, but from a policy standpoint, the standpoint of what we're trying to accomplish, it's challenging to know what to do. There are, as I mentioned earlier, there are no risk-free paths now. It's not incredibly obvious what to do. So we have to keep our eye on inflation. At the same time, we cannot ignore and must keep our eye on maximum employment, which is those are our two equal goals. And you will see that there are a range of views on what to do. Nonetheless, we came together today at the meeting and acted with a high degree of unity.
Archie.
Thank you, Archie Hawken, The Economist. You mentioned earlier that job creation was running below your guess at its break-even rate. I'd be curious to hear a bit more about that and where you think the break-even rate is.
You know, so there are many different ways to calculate it, and none of them is perfect. But you know, it's clearly come way down. You could could say it's somewhere between 0 and 50,000, and you'd be right or wrong. I mean, there's just many different ways to do it. So wherever it was, 150,000, 200,000 a few months ago, it's come down quite significantly, and that's because a very lower amount of people are joining the labor force. The labor force really not growing much at this point, and that's a lot of where the supply of labor was coming from over the last 2 or 3 years. So we're not getting that now. We've got much lower demand. It's interesting that supply and demand have really come down together so far, except now we do have unemployment ticking up outside, just one tick outside of the range where it's been for a year. 4.3% is still a low level, but I think this level of this speedy decline in both supply and demand has certainly gotten everyone's attention.
If I may, you mentioned the downside risk to employment a fair amount, but it's striking that measures of kind of activity and output for the third quarter, those that we have, seem pretty strong. The Atlanta Fed's GDP now is very strong.
Supply and demand have really come down together so far, except now we do have unemployment ticking up outside, just one tick outside of the range where it's been for a year. 4.3% is still a low level, but I think this level of this speedy decline in both supply and demand has certainly gotten everyone's attention.
If I may, you mentioned the downside risk to employment a fair amount, but it's striking that measures of kind of activity and output for the third quarter, those that we have, seem pretty strong. The Atlanta Fed's GDP now is very strong. You mentioned strong PCE numbers as well. How do you square those things? Is there a chance actually could be upside risk to the labor market if those activity measures are all right?
Well, that would be great. We'd love that to happen. So I don't know that you see a big tension there, but it's gratifying to see that economic activity is holding in. It's a good bit from consumption. It looks like consumption was stronger than expected. What we got earlier this week, I guess. And also we're getting a fairly narrow sector is producing a lot of economic activity, which is the AI build out and business investment. So we watch all of it, and I would say we did move up. The median for growth for this year actually moved up in the SEP between the June and September SEPs. So and really the inflation and labor market didn't change much. It's really the risks that we're seeing to the labor market that were the focus of today's decision.
Nicole.
Hi, Nicole Goodkind with Barron's. Thank you for taking my question. Given the cumulative impact of high interest rates on the housing sector, I'm wondering how concerned you are that current rate levels are exacerbating housing affordability issues and potentially hindering household formation and wealth accumulation for a segment of the population?
Housing is an interest-sensitive activity, so it's at the very center of monetary policy. When the pandemic hit and we cut rates to zero, the housing companies were incredibly grateful, and it was really, they said that was the only thing that kept them going, was that we cut so aggressively and provided credit and things like that, and they were able to finance because we did that. The other side of that is when inflation gets high and we raise rates, and you're right, it does burden the housing industry, and so rates have come down a bit, and as that happens, we don't set mortgage rates, but our policy rate changes do tend to affect mortgage rates, and that has been happening, and that'll of course raise demand. Lower borrowing rates for builders will help will help supply, and so some of that should happen. I think most analysts think that it would have to be pretty big changes for it to matter a lot, for the big changes in rates to matter a lot for the housing sector. And the other thing is by achieving maximum employment and price stability, that's a strong economy. That's a good economy for housing. And then the last thing I'll say is, there's a deeper problem here. There's not a cyclical problem that the Fed can address, and that just is a pretty much nationwide housing shortage. Or a lot of places in the country just don't have enough housing for people, and all of the areas around metropolitan areas like Washington, for example, are very built up, and so you're having to build farther and farther out, and So that's where it is.
And just a quick follow-up, during the last SEP, or the press conference following the last SEP, that was conviction about their projections. Everyone still feel that way.
You know, forecasting is very difficult, even last. And as we mentioned before, forecasters are a humble lot with much to be humble about. So I think right now is a particularly challenging time, even more uncertain than usual. And so I don't know any forecaster anywhere really. That's one of the forecasters that have great confidence in the forecast, right? I think they'll ask no.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. If you're cutting rates, why continue to reduce the size of your balance sheet and pause the unwinding?
Well, I think we're cutting the size of our balance sheet quite marginally now. As you know, with the balance sheet, we're still in an abundant reserves condition, and we've said that we would stop somewhat above somewhat above an ample reserves level. That's what we are, and we're getting closer to that. We're monitoring it very carefully. We don't think that has at all significant macroeconomic effects. These are pretty small numbers moving around inside a giant economy. You know, the level of runoff is not very large. So I wouldn't attribute macroeconomic consequences to that at this point.
And at his recent confirmation hearing, Stephen Myron brought up that the Fed actually has 3 mandates from Congress, not just jobs and stable prices, but also moderate long-term interest rates. So what does Congress mean by moderate long-term interest rates? How should we understand that when we see the 10-year Treasury moving? And how do you think about this part of the mandate when policy choices like rate cuts or balance sheet reductions affect the long end of the yield curve?
So we always think of it as the dual mandate, maximum employment and price stability, for a long time, because we think moderate long-term interest rates are something that will result from stable inflation, low and stable inflation, and maximum employment. So we haven't thought about that for a very long time as a third mandate that requires independent action. So that's where that is. And there's no thought of, as far as I'm concerned, there's no thought of considering that we somehow incorporate that in as something in a different way.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Matt Egan from CNN. We recently learned that average FICO credit scores are down this year by 2 points, the most since 2009 during the Great Recession. Delinquencies are high for car loans, personal loans, credit cards. How concerned, if at all, are you about the health of consumer finances? And do you expect today's cut will help?
So, we're aware of that. I think default rates have been kind of ticking up, and we do watch that. They're not at a level, I don't believe they're at a level where overall they're terribly concerning, but it is something that we watch. Lower rates should support economic activity. I don't know that one rate cut will have a visible effect on that, but over time, a strong economy with a strong labor market is what we're aiming for, and stable prices. So that should help.
Just to follow up, this rate cut is coming at a time when the stock market is at or near all-time highs, and some valuation metrics are elevated historically. Is there a risk that cutting rates could overheat financial markets, potentially fueling a bubble?
We're tightly focused on our goals, right? And our goals are maximum employment and price stability. And so we take the actions that we take with an eye on those goals. Separately, and that's why we did what we did today. Separately, we monitor financial stability very, very carefully. And, I would say it's a mixed picture, but households are in good shape. Banks are in good shape. Overall, households are still in good shape in the aggregate. And I know that people at the lower end of the income spectrum are under pressure, obviously. But from a financial stability perspective, we monitor that picture. We don't have a view that there's a right or wrong level of asset prices for any particular financial asset, but we monitor the whole picture, really looking for structural vulnerabilities And I would say those are not elevated right now.
Jean, we'll go to you for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell. Jean Young with MNI Market News. I wanted to ask about inflation expectations. You've said the Fed can't take the stability of inflation expectations for granted. You mentioned at the short run they've gone up a little bit. I wonder if you can talk a bit about that. And then also at the long run, wondering, do you see evidence that the debate over Fed independence and the growing deficit is putting pressure on inflation expectations?
So as you said, shorter term inflation expectations have tended to respond to near term inflation. So if inflation goes up, inflation expectations will predict that it takes just a little while to get back down. Fortunately, throughout this period, longer term inflation expectations both break even in the markets, and almost all of the longer term surveys, Michigan being a bit of an outlier lately, have been just rock solid in terms of running at levels that are consistent with 2% inflation over time. So we don't take that for granted. We actually assume that our actions have a real effect on that, and that we need to continually show and also discuss our commitment to 2% inflation. And so you'll hear us doing that. We're, as I mentioned, it's a difficult situation because we have risks that are both affecting the labor market and inflation. Those are our two goals, and so we have to balance those two. When they're both at risk, we have to balance them. And
Mayor Hoy Biden is sponsored.
Okay. This is enough document. Enough document. Okay. Let me document this one about interest rate decision today. First of all, an interest rate is the cost of borrowing money or the return on saving or investing money, usually expressed as a percentage per year. Two main perspectives. One, when you borrow money, interest rate is equal to cost of borrowing. You may you pay extra money interest in addition to repaying the amount you borrowed, the principal. Example, you borrow 1,000 at an interest rate of 5% per year. After 1 year, you owe 1,050. That is 1,000 principal plus 50 interest. Okay, two, when you save or invest money, interest rate is equal to reward for saving. You earn extra money interest on top of your saving. Example, you deposit 1,000 in a saving account with a 5% interest rate. After 1 year, you will have 1,050. And there is different type of interest rates: simple interest rate, compound interest rate, and there is some also affecting loans like mortgage, car loans, credit cards. Generally, so much. So Jerome Powell done his job today, and the stock market is a little bit starting to raise. Okay, let me close here.